When we left off last time, Adam and Eve had been removed from the Garden of Eden. And at this point in time, the earth was still a better place to live than our current earth. And if Adam and Eve had conceived shortly after, then this artist's rendering might be showing you a couple of 2-year-olds raising a 1-year-old. And this picture is only showing you one child, as some people think that Cain and Abel are twins. The Bible mentions conception, and then Cain is born. Then it mentions Abel being born, but it didn't mention a separate conception, so they may very well have been twins. Regardless, we find that Adam and Eve have many sons and daughters. That's from reading chapter 5. Now the question arises, just how many children did they have? The record for this is in our modern era, and it's over 60 children in about 40 years time span by a Russian woman living in the 1700s. Although this record is disputed, they did record the father's name, and later in his life, he married a second wife and had over a dozen children with her. You might say, how did the first wife have so many children in such a short time? Well, she had more than one set of twins and triplets. But this is just what might be possible in our era. But Eve is living in an era where people live on average around 912 years. We don't know when she would have gone into menopause. It might have been around age 450. And since people are living healthier lives, would it really surprise us if she had over 200 children by taking a year off in between each pregnancy and the occasional set of twins? We're not told all of those details, as the Bible focused on the way sin affected the everyday lives of simple things like family and brotherly relationships. After God had performed the first sacrifice for Adam and Eve, it apparently set up some sort of regulation or how to perform a sacrifice from time to time. We aren't told how often they were supposed to do this. Many times it may have been voluntary. But I suspect that it needed to be done by the head of each household. I can't exactly prove that, but we'll see more examples of that later on. Cain, being the firstborn, seems to be destined for trouble. In many cultures, they have high hopes for the firstborn son, and yet time after time, God would choose the secondborn, or even lower, to accomplish his goals. Jacob instead of Esau, Isaac instead of Ishmael, David instead of his 7 brothers. Cain brings items that don't require the shedding of blood. Cain is trying to get by with his works. Even after receiving instructions on how to do things properly, Cain would rather shed his brother's blood than to do the right thing. Not only is this the first murder, but there are other firsts as well. Abel is the first martyr. Abel is now also a prototype of Jesus by being struck down while innocent, as well as being a shepherd. While Cain would try to deny what he did, God drives Cain out. This will be a prototype of God's enemies being driven out on Judgment Day. But Cain complains about his punishment. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. And I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me. Note the words, every one that findeth me shall slay me. To me, this indicates that there are other sons of Adam, and possibly the sons of Abel, that will be trying to avenge their father. Also, when an additional son is born and mentioned, we are told that Adam is 130 years old at this point. Seth is named because it's through his lineage that would lead to Noah. We aren't told when Cain and Abel were born, but given a time period of over 100 years to produce children, and those children producing children, it's safe to say there's over 500 people by now. And while the world makes fun of Cain taking a wife, whom the Bible doesn't give us every boring detail about her, we Christians are supposed to be unable to answer that burning question, where did Cain get his wife? That supposed all-important question is answered in Genesis chapter 5. Cain took a sister to be married. Now, before you get all grossed out at that, keep in mind they are living in a much healthier condition than you are. This is still before the flood. After the flood changes everything, God would later give them rules about marrying close relations, as more and more sicknesses would start to arise. And yet, while the world questions where Cain's wife came from, they don't seem to have the same kind of questions about where Seth got his wife. And that's because they couldn't handle the first 4 chapters, which shows that mankind is sinful and evil. They can't handle the Bible because it tells the truth. They want books that flatter them and say that mankind is improving and getting better and better. But we're not. And so early on, these altars were built as a forerunner to Jesus taking care of this in the future. Even into the book of Job, we have him giving sacrifices on behalf of the immediate family. And later, when God explains to Job what's been happening, God doesn't tell him to stop sacrificing on behalf of other people. This is because they were living in a different dispensation. And I realize that word dispensation is sometimes a bad word, according to some of our brethren. In our current dispensation, we can pray for people, but it doesn't cover their sins. And this shows up over and over again. When Noah steps off the ark, he builds an altar. These family altars would continue until God gave them his law through Moses. Then the high priest was set up, and people entered into the dispensation of law. And that's why it's important to rightly divide the word of truth, as you were instructed to do in the New Testament. Today, as Christians, we aren't to avoid the fruit of a tree. As a Christian, we aren't told to save ourselves by getting on a boat. Sadly, a few of our fellow Christians are scared of this kind of teaching. They fear that we are wanting them to stay away from parts of the Bible, or that we have a super sinister plan to get rid of parts of the Bible. But all we're trying to do is keep them straight on their salvation. But we'll talk more about that later.